Bees can cope with a lot of different things. They have an incredible successful evolution. And just for the last 100 years, we just cut and destroyed the natural evolution. And today we have nearly all of the bee colonies in beekeeping. So beekeepers who feed, beekeepers who treat, beekeepers who prevent the colonies from swarming. And there you can see that under these conditions it's just not possible to adapt to changes. So it's not possible to adapt to new mites, it's not possible to adapt to climate change.
Stick your neck out. The weekly podcast of the Giraffe Heroes Foundation.
Welcome back to the Giraffe Heroes Foundation podcast. I'm Tom Amatt, your today's host. This session, as well as the next 5 sessions approximately, will bring you highlights of the Giraffe Heroes Foundation GHF 2020 crowdfunding project, Giraffes for Ecology and Climate Adaptation. Our today's guest is André Wermelinger, Fribourg, Schweiz. André is the founder and leader of the NGO Free the Bees. André also has been commended a Giraffe Heroes for his work about half a year ago. And André, last not least, is the co-manager of our crowdfunding campaign together with Jan-Pierre and myself. André, welcome to our little studio here.
Thank you, it's an honor being here.
Everybody is talking about climate change, almost as many people are talking about bees, about the bee malaise, about bees dying, about bees infected with foul brood, varroa mite, etc., etc. We know you take a slightly different take on that. Could you give us your opinion regarding the bee issue in general?
Well, let's look at the reasons why bees are dying. So there are several factors from the outside where an apiculture beekeeper cannot really influence. So like pesticides, which for sure are a big problem for the bees. What we do with Free the Bees, we look much more on the inside of a beekeeper, and the beekeeper is somehow responsible for this bees mortality too, and the beekeeper doesn't really let natural selection play. So we have bees as a production animals. We use bees as production animals and we push them to maximum of work. So we want to have a maximum of honey, we feed them sugar, we prevent them from swarming, we treat them 3 to 4 times a year on a regular basis with organic acids, which is like some kind of heavy treatment. And this leads just to heavy side effects, and bees under these conditions, they cannot adapt to their nature anymore, and they cannot adapt neither to natural changes and to climate changes, whatever it is.
But are we not doing similar things to other husbandry animals? I mean, cows are exploited to give more milk, since as long as the bees are being kept to produce honey. So what is it what makes the bees more affected than a cow?
Yeah, we are doing the same things to other animals like cows. And if you compare, for example, what the cow is producing and how this production had been augmented since 1960, we have more or less doubled the amount of milk getting out of a cow since 1960. And in the meantime, since 1960, we have quadrupled the amount of honey we get out of a beehive. So we are much more intensive with the honeybees than with cows. And this, in the same time, we have lost much biodiversity, so plants, flowers, which deliver nectar. So this makes it really strange. We augment the production and we lose resources in the nature. And now there's another difference. I mean, cows are not really heavily important for nature, but bees are. So it's some kind of key resources. And cows we can somehow have in stable.
In stables. That's what I just wanted to ask. I mean, I see what you are saying. I mean, it's a highly interesting fact which I wasn't aware of, that the exploitation of honey from bees has been quadrupled since the last 60 years, whereas the poor cows only needed to double their milk production. That alone is quite stunning. Is it correct to say that apart from that, the bee is actually only, so to speak, a semi-husbandry animal, because the bee flies out into the nature, whereas the cow is always behind the fence, if not locked up in a stable altogether, whereas bees are still, so to speak, engaging with nature even while being kept for honey to be eaten by humans?
Well, I think we have to differentiate. In a legal term, we have made somehow out of the bees a husbandry animal, but in a clearly biological, genetical way, it's still a wild animal. So we have first proofs and first protocols from authorities that it's clearly also a wild animal, not only a husbandry animal, and this is very important for us because we want to protect and promote the wild animal.
Is that a key argument of Free the Bees, your organization?
Yes, it is. It's one of the pillars we rely on, that we need to protect and promote the wild living honeybees, as they are linked to natural selection. So the ones adapted, they survive, they can multiplicate. The ones not adapted, they just die. It seems like it was horrible, lots of bees dying, but it's an important natural principle which guarantees the adaptation to climate change and to other things, new diseases coming up, new parasites, whatever. So bees can adapt, they need to adapt, and we need to give them the place and the time to adapt.
So is this whole thing of the varroa mite something like, say, a really bad virus? I mean, a little bit worse than COVID-19, but it's just still something which can be adapted to and ultimately overcome.
Yeah, there are heavy links between varroa mites and coronaviruses. I mean, both are some kind. We look at it in a monocausal way, and we just look at the aggressors, and we don't look at the immune systems. And there are very powerful processes where wild living honeybees can protect themselves from viruses, from varroa mites, from whatever can attack them. And those processes, they cannot install if we try to help the bees. I mean, we can just try to give them the best conditions possible so that they can develop those processes and the behaviors to protect themselves.
But that's absolutely fascinating, because what you are saying, if I understand that correctly, is that the bees' problem is not the varroa mite or whatever mite, but actually the human-created environment for them.
Yes, you can tell it like this. We clearly know that varroa mites and honeybees, they can live together and they can adapt to each other, so they can coexist. So this we know in a scientific manner, we know it in a practical manner, and we know as well that if we start treating and we try to help bees to cope with the varroa mite, we don't let them adapt themselves. So we destroy the natural adaptation and we just try to help, but in a very short-term thinking. So probably today we might help, but we destroy completely the natural evolution and the adaptation process. And the varroa mite is just one problem today. Tomorrow we will have new ones, and in the future we will have plenty of new ones. So we need to have other strategies to cope with such parasites, with such viruses, than what we do actually in our civilization.
That's a really fascinating statement. And actually, if I think about it, then our subject is climate adaptation, or in the same way it's climate change. However, we can't change the climate or back change the climate, so we need to adapt. Now, if I remember correctly, bees have a history of some 45 million years, is that correct?
Well, in a scientific way, they talk about more than 30 millions of years, but some are telling it must be at least 45 million years. It might be even more, so we don't really know.
Okay, so but that proves that bees are extremely adaptable. I mean, they apparently have survived probably one of the last mass extinctions. So it seems that it is an equally then worrying phenomenon that these apparently most resilient beings are being threatened by extinction due to the fact of a human species industrializing the planet, to say it in a short word.
This is clearly right, that it's the human civilization that takes the responsibility for this actual bees problem. And bees can cope with a lot of different things. They could, as you just said, 45 millions of years, they have an incredible successful evolution. And just for the last 100 years, we just cut and destroyed the natural evolution. And today we have nearly all of the bee colonies in beekeeping. So beekeepers who feed, beekeepers who treat, beekeepers who prevent the swarming, beekeepers who prevent the colonies from swarming. And there you can see that under these conditions it's just not possible to adapt to changes. So it's not possible to adapt to new mites, it's not possible to adapt to climate change. And that's where we propose solutions with Free the Bees.
And these solutions apparently go in the direction that we have to change much more than the bees have to change. You are listening to the Giraffe Heroes Foundation podcast. Our today's guest in the studio is André Wermelinger, founder of Free the Bees and co-manager of the GHF 2020 crowdfunding campaign, Giraffes for Ecology and Climate Adaptation. André, in your part as a participant of our crowdfunding, you offer, Free the Bees is offering some very interesting rewards which do not fit in the normal rewards box of a crowdfunding campaign. They are rather actually objects, products, or even bee dogs, which seem to be part of the remediation of the bee problem, or which seem to be part of the strategy to actually cope with the bee crisis, to make a new adaptation of them possible. And that also would mean make the adaptation to the present climate crisis possible. Could you describe these rewards a bit more? For example, I guess many of our listeners won't have a clue what a Klotzbeute means. So as a rewards, you offer a Klotzbeute. Not only a Klotzbeute as a product, you also offer that everyone who is interested could make his own Klotzbeute. What does that mean and what can you do with it?
By the way, a Klotzbeute, you can call it log hive in English. There are different words for
a log hive.
A log hive. Klotzbeute is just a German word. And just to have an impression, it's just a hollowed piece of a tree. And let's just think what bees need for living in nature. And one of the most important things for bees is just their own habitat, so their home. And they have always lived in tree cavities. That means quite old trees with quite big cavities. They need a volume of around 30 to 40 liters, which is quite big, which means that the plant, the tree needs to be quite old. And this is one of the problems in our forestry. We don't really have those old trees anymore. We don't really have the cavities anymore. So bees, they don't really have their natural habitat anymore. And we know now that the natural habitat has some very interesting parameters in terms of insulation, in terms of energy you need to bring in to heat the habitat. It's like some kind of a miniature house. We know that there are some very important factors in terms of humidity. And this is what we try to reproduce. We try to give the bees back their natural habitat with hollowed trees, tree cavities. And the first step, we went down to learn how in the Middle Ages beekeepers, they kept their bees. And this is the so-called Zeidlerei in German, tree beekeeping in English. And so we can learn a lot from the Middle Ages because the beekeepers, they just kept the bees in a more natural manner. And now we went a step further and we started to create the most adapted tree cavities, but in an artificial way. So we tried to understand the log hive, we tried to understand the tree cavity in a living tree, and we started to simulate. And this helps us to produce lots of habitats in a very good quality and bring them back to nature, bring them back to the forest, but bring them back to pre-Alps, bring them back to even cities, whatever, it doesn't matter. We just need to give the bees its habitat, and there all the rest is done by nature. And that's very important.
That's fascinating. That means I can go to Free the Bees and say I want such a log hive or Klotzbeute, and then they have one and I select it, or they show me how to do it if I have enough time, and then I take the clots and put it back into my garden, or what?
Yes, this is right. We give courses on bees in general. What do they need? How can you produce honey in a more natural and sustainable manner? And if you really have the time and if you really would like to know how you can produce such a log hive, such a Klotzbeute, we will show you. It's quite, it takes about 2 days, and it takes some muscles, and it's physical, so you will sweat during working, but it's very interesting. Those are great courses. And if you just say, I would like to give a habitat in my own garden, but I don't have the time for doing a log hive by myself, so you can just order one and we will send you over the habitat, and then you just wait and you hope that there are bees coming into this habitat, and then you enjoy and you look at it and just look at what bees will tell you in your garden.
Sounds absolutely fascinating. I invite everybody to order such a thing and help the dying bee, the infected bee, to get back to a more natural habitat. Yeah, but then what's a Swiss tree? That is also something you offer. It sounds even more special.
Yes, those Swiss trees, they are exactly this simulation of the natural habitat. So instead of digging out, hollowing a piece of a tree, which is time consuming and a lot of work, so we produce Swiss trees on a professional way, and they have somehow the same parameters as a natural cavity in the nature. but we can produce it in much bigger numbers, quantities. We can have very controlled parameters, and we can make some scientific studies in such habitats, which is not really the case in different natural habitats.
I see, it's so to speak the monitored natural environment.
Exactly. And there is probably another interesting thing. We have different Swiss tree lines. And we have one Swiss tree where we put the focus much more on the habitat, and we produce it in a way that you can even open and have a look into the bees. So this is very interesting for just checking, learning. And we have another line where you can much more act as a beekeeper and even produce little quantities of honey, but honey in a better quality and honey in a more sustainable way.
That really sounds like an absolutely fascinating product. I think everybody should prepare himself to look deeper into that. Now to come to this other fascinating reward item, maybe, that is the bee dog. You offer to sponsor a bee dog which kind of replaces or does the work of the traditional beekeeper in a much faster way. How should that work?
There's a special illness called foul brood. There's the European foul brood and the American foul brood. Bees, especially in the apiary, under beekeeping conditions, they suffer from this illness. It's just the brood being attacked by bacteria. And when the brood gets ill, this smells in a quite horrible way. We as beekeepers, we can smell this too, but only when the illness is already quite developed. So this led us to the idea that we should probably try to train dogs, because they can sniff in a molecular way.
Yes.
And detect our foul brood in a very, very early stage, as they can detect explosives, as they can detect drugs, and as they can detect other things like beetles in the forest or whatever. And this is a very interesting project, because for the first time we will be able to check beehives without the need of opening and stressing the bees. So for the moment we need to open all the beehives regularly and check whether there is an illness. And when we open, we just destroy the whole microclimate, we stress the bees, and this can lead to the illness which we want to prevent. So quite stupid somehow. And we can check the hives without opening, and especially we can check wild living colonies living in hollowed trees, in tree cavities. And for today we don't have any possibility of checking such bee colonies. So this will be the first time where we can say whether a wild living colony is ill or not. And this helps us a lot to protect and to promote those bees.
Well, that sounds like a real breakthrough in the way to deal with bees. I mean, you make use of something well known, namely that dogs have extremely sensitive noses.
Yes.
And you apply that to the bee in terms of detecting not only their ailments, but also, so to speak, to confirm that they are healthy, perhaps in the case of a wild living swarm in a natural tree.
I think it's some kind of innovation in beekeeping, and we think that we will be able to check this illness, to control this illness in a much more efficient and effective way than we do it today by bee inspectors.
That's fantastic. I mean, I really think this is something which is only amazing that nobody hasn't come up with the idea before, but then again, beekeeping in the way of today's way, which apparently is harmful to the bees in a fundamental sense, only has a history of 100 years. So after 100 years, André comes up with a solution that is still kind of quite fast in terms of a historical process. Anyhow, we maybe have not that much time left anymore to talk about trees, but I think today's subject really are the bees, but it already has become apparent that trees are extremely important for bees because the tree provides the ideal natural habitat. The old tree provides the ideal natural habitat through its hollow cavities for a natural bee swarm. So understanding that today, of course, the key subject is the bees, but since our campaign is about bees and trees, so one word about trees, André.
Well, just probably a link that bees are dependent on trees. They are dependent on old trees with cavities in it, and they are dependent on a large variety of different trees because they are a good resource of nectar too. Let's take the example of a linden tree, which had been in European forests, and now you need to search a long time for finding a linden tree in a forest. And this is a very good nectar source in a perfect moment for the bees. And if you don't have linden trees, if you don't have a broad variety of trees in your forest, if you only have beech trees, for example, in Switzerland, and some epicea, you just have a lack of food in the forest. So we need the broad variety, we need the old trees, we need the habitat trees, and this is very important.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, actually, this is, so to speak, a great lead over to our next podcast, which will focus on trees. As for today, regarding our crowdfunding campaign, Giraffes for Ecology and Climate Adaptation, which is starting next week, do you have a wish or a vision for all of us for this campaign, or would you like to say something to the crowd, which is hopefully going to follow in innumerable amounts?
Well, I just think that we are facing challenges which we can only find solutions in the whole civilization. So what we are doing, I mean, we show up solutions, but we need everyone to think it himself, herself, and we need support for bringing these solutions into the mass. And I just ask everyone to really help and be part of this movement and help the bees, help the nature, and this is really our foundation for human living.
Yes, thank you, André. I mean, this is really about bees and trees as much as it is about us humans. I mean, us humans are the cause of potential disaster, but us humans hopefully will be also the remedy of that disaster. And it's very late, but the human character says it's never too late. Let's hope that Free the Bees is going to be ever so successful. And of course, please join our crowdfunding campaign next week. Please make sure that you look at what you are doing, and we are welcoming everybody to join hands and work together, work for bees, work for trees, but above all, work for a society getting healthy again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Stick your neck out. The weekly podcast of the Giraffe Heroes Foundation.